The orbital trade station, called the Cradle of Tongues, floated in the darkness between two dead stars, spinning slowly like a forgotten coin tossed into the void 1,000 years ago, and never caught by anyone. It was the kind of place where species that hated each other still needed to do business. So they came, and they traded, and they drank, and they tried very hard not to kill each other before the cargo was loaded. Commander Lena Vasquez sat alone in a drinking alcove near the back of the station's largest bar, her boots propped on the table, and a tablet resting on her knee, as she scrolled through cargo manifests that were almost certainly falsified by at least 3 different species. She was not a soldier, not officially anyway. She was a linguist, a cultural liaison for the Terran Union, the kind of person they sent to smooth over the rough edges when human merchant crews said the wrong thing to the wrong alien and nearly started an interstellar incident over a mispronounced greeting. She was 34 years old, and she spoke 19 languages fluently, including 4 that most xenolinguists considered impossible for the human throat to produce. She was also small. By Terran standards she was average, but by galactic standards she was tiny, barely reaching the chest of most species that walked through the cradle's corridors. This was something aliens noticed immediately, and it was something they always misunderstood. The bar was busy that night, filled with the usual mix of traders and smugglers and diplomats pretending they were not diplomats, when the main doors slid open and the air in the room changed, the way air changes when a predator walks into a space full of prey. 7 Dravasi warriors entered in formation. The Dravasi were reptilian, cold-blooded in both body and temperament, standing 7 feet tall with scaled hides the color of burnt iron, and eyes like molten copper split by vertical black slits. They were a conquest culture, a species that had built their entire civilization on the principle that the strong took and the weak submitted, and their language reflected this, with every word carrying an undertone of dominance or submission, depending on how loudly it was spoken. Their leader walked at the front, and he was the largest of them all. Warlord Krethvas had conquered 12 star systems in his career, and he had personally killed more enemies than most species could count. He wore his battle scars openly, because in Dravosi culture scars were currency, and he was very, very wealthy. He was also furious. The Terran Union had recently blocked Dravosi expansion into the Helios corridor, not through force, but through diplomacy, a word the Dravosi considered so offensive that it did not even exist in their formal language. They had been outmaneuvered by talking, by negotiating, by the soft, careful, patient work of people like Lena Vasquez and Krethvas had come to the Cradle of Tongues carrying that humiliation like a wound that would not close. His copper eyes swept the bar and landed on the small Terran woman sitting alone with the Union insignia on her jacket. He smiled, and when a Dravasi smiled, it showed every single one of their 96 teeth. He crossed the bar in 4 strides, his warband fanning out behind him, and he stood over Lena's table like a mountain deciding whether or not to fall on a village. Terran, he growled, and the word came out in the Dravasi dominant register, the tone reserved for addressing creatures considered beneath contempt. Your species hides behind words, because you are too weak to hold a weapon. Every head in the bar turned. Lena looked up from her tablet slowly, the way a person looks up when they have been interrupted from something important by something that is not. And then she spoke. Dravosi, the ancient formal tongue that had not been commonly used in centuries, the language of their warrior poets and founding conquerors. And she spoke it with an accent so perfect that 3 of Krethvas's own warriors visibly flinched. She quoted a verse from Therok the Unbroken, the most revered Dravosi poet general in their history, and the verse she chose translated roughly to this: the fool roars at the river and believes he has frightened the water, never knowing the current has already carved the stone beneath his feet. The bar went completely silent. No alien had ever bothered to learn Old Dravosi verse because no alien had ever respected the Dravosi enough to study their deepest culture, and no alien had ever been clever enough to use it as a weapon. Krethvaz stood frozen for 3 full seconds. His warband stared at him, waiting, and he could feel their eyes on his back like blades, and he knew that if he did not respond to this insult with force, then his authority would begin to crack in ways that could never be repaired. So he did the only thing his pride allowed him to do. He lunged forward and grabbed Lena Vasquez by the throat. His massive clawed hand wrapped entirely around her neck, and he lifted her off her feet like she weighed nothing at all, because to him she did weigh nothing at all. He brought her face close to his and snarled through clenched teeth that he would crush the voice out of her, that he would squeeze until the clever words stopped, and the only sound left was the wet crack of a Terran windpipe folding in on itself. The bar erupted in shouts and the sound of chairs being knocked over as people scrambled to get away from what they were certain was about to become a murder. But Lena did not panic. She did not claw at his hand. She did not kick or scream or beg. She looked directly into his copper slit-pupiled eyes with an expression that was calm, focused, and utterly without fear. And in that moment Krethvaz felt something he had never felt in his entire life. He felt doubt. And then she moved. Her right palm shot upward and struck a precise point beneath his jaw, where the Dravosi laryngeal nerve cluster sat exposed between 2 plates of cartilage, a vulnerability so small that most combat manuals did not even list it. Her left hand twisted his gripping wrist at an angle that Dravosi joints were never meant to bend, and the pain was so sharp and so immediate that his fingers sprang open like a trap released. Her knee drove into a nerve bundle on his inner thigh that every Terran xenobiology textbook identified as the Dravosi motor loss point, the place where a single hard strike could shut down voluntary muscle control for up to 30 seconds. The whole thing took less than 3 seconds. Krethvaz hit the floor like a falling building, his body convulsing, his mouth open, in a silent scream that produced no sound at all. Lena landed on her feet, straightened her collar, walked back to her table, and sat down. The bar was so quiet that you could hear the station's air recyclers humming 2 decks above. Krethvaz's warband rushed to their leader and hauled him upright. But something was wrong, something beyond the obvious humiliation of a supreme warlord being dropped by a creature half his size. He was trying to speak, and nothing was coming out. No words, no growls, no sounds of any kind. The station's medical AI ran emergency scans on him within the hour, and the prognosis arrived like a death sentence delivered in a calm and clinical voice. The strike to his laryngeal nerve cluster had caused cascading neural damage to the surrounding tissue, and the connections between his brain and his vocal apparatus had been severed permanently. Warlord Krethvaz, conqueror of 12 star systems, terror of the outer reach, had lost his voice. He would never speak again. Back in the bar, Lena Vasquez finished her cargo manifests, closed her tablet, and flagged down the bartender. She ordered another drink, and she drank it slowly, because it had been a long day, and she still had reports to file, and sometimes the universe just needed reminding that the smallest person in the room was not the weakest. And somewhere in the medical bay of the Cradle of Tongues, a warlord opened his mouth to scream his rage at the ceiling, and heard nothing but silence. Dominion hung in orbit above the throne world, like a beast waiting to be fed. It was the largest warship in the Dravosi fleet, a vessel built to inspire terror in anything that saw it, and inside its deepest chamber sat a warlord who could not make a sound. Krethvos sat alone in his command room, surrounded by the trophies of 12 conquered systems, the skulls and banners and broken weapons of enemies he had defeated across decades of war. And none of it meant anything anymore. Because in Dravasi culture, voice was everything. Voice was power. Voice was identity. Voice was the proof that you were alive and strong and worthy of the air you breathed. A Dravasi warrior who could not speak, could not issue battle commands, could not perform the war chants that were required before every engagement, could not recite the blood litany that confirmed his rank before the conclave. A voiceless warrior was called severed in the Dravasi tongue, meant spiritually dead, disconnected from the great chain of conquerors that stretched back to the founding of their civilization. Krethvos was severed, and everyone knew it. His second-in-command, a younger warrior named Thalreese, who had always been too ambitious and too patient, began to circle. Thalreese did not challenge Krethvos openly because that was not his way. He was the kind of predator who waited until the wounded animal could no longer stand before he moved in. And so instead, he simply began making observations. He observed loudly in the mess halls that a warlord who could not recite the blood litany could not technically hold rank. He observed casually in the training chambers that the warriors were uncertain, and that uncertainty in a Dravosi warband was the first crack before the collapse. He observed to anyone who would listen that perhaps it was time for new leadership, not because he wanted it, of course, but because tradition demanded it. Krethvos heard all of this, because losing his voice had not made him deaf, and every word Thalreese spoke was like a blade dragged slowly across already raw flesh. But there was nothing he could do. He could not shout Thalreese into submission, could not use the dominance register to remind the younger warrior of his place, could not even growl a warning that would carry weight in a culture that measured authority by volume. He was the most powerful Dravasi alive, and he was completely powerless. The High Conclave, the ruling body of the Dravasi Dominion, summoned him to answer for the incident at the cradle. And when he stood before the assembled warlords and generals and political elders, he saw something in their eyes that hurt worse than any wound he had ever taken in battle. He saw pity. They demanded to know how a single Terran female, a linguist no less, had destroyed one of their most decorated warriors. Seconds. They pulled every intelligence file the Dominion had ever compiled on the human species, and what they found made the pity in their eyes turn slowly and unmistakably into fear. The reports showed that Terrans did not merely learn the languages of species they encountered. They studied everything, every single thing, anatomy and physiology and neurology and cultural psychology and social hierarchy and mating rituals and dietary requirements and pain responses and stress reactions. They mapped every species they met with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Terran diplomats were not just translators. They were cross-trained in disciplines that included advanced xenobiology and adaptive combat techniques, tailored specifically to the physiology of whatever species they were assigned to work with. Lena Vasquez had spent 4 years studying Dravasi neuromuscular anatomy as part of her linguistic research, because understanding how the Dravasi throat works, produced its complex range of dominant and submissive tones, required understanding every nerve and muscle and cartilage plate involved in Dravasi vocalization. She had learned how their voice worked, so she could speak their language perfectly. And in doing so, she had learned exactly how to break it. The conclave sat in heavy silence as the implications sank in like poison into water. Every Terran diplomat, every linguist, every cultural attaché assigned to a Dravasi posting had the same training, the same knowledge, the same terrifying precision. And the Dravasi had been letting them walk freely through their space for years. One elder finally spoke and said what they were all thinking. The humans did not just learn your language, they learned how to dismantle you, and they called it cultural studies. Meanwhile, in his private quarters, stripped of command duties, and left with nothing but time and silence, Krethvos began to read. Dravosi texts, he had read all of those. But Terran texts, human literature and history and philosophy, downloaded from the diplomatic archives that the Terran Union made freely available to any species that wanted them, because humans were generous with their knowledge in ways that other species found suspicious. He read about human wars, which were more numerous and more brutal than anything the Dravosi had ever experienced. And this surprised him, because he had been told that humans were a soft species. He read about human survival, about a species that had clawed its way to dominance on a death world, full of predators and diseases and natural disasters that would have wiped out most other sentient races in their infancy. And then he found something that stopped him completely. He found a reference to something called sign language. He read about it for hours, barely understanding at first, and then understanding too much all at once. Developed entire complex languages that used no voice at all. Languages built from hand movements and facial expressions and body positions. Languages that were as rich and deep and nuanced as any spoken tongue. Languages created specifically so that humans who could not hear or could not speak were never cut off from communication, never severed. The concept hit Krethvos like a physical blow. In Dravasi culture, losing your voice meant losing everything. It meant you were finished, discarded, dead in every way that mattered. But humans, these small, soft, fragile humans, had looked at the problem of voicelessness thousands of years ago, and instead of accepting it as the end, they had invented an entirely new way to speak. They had refused to let silence win. Krethvos sat in his dark chamber for a long time after reading this, his massive clawed hands resting on his knees, and for the first time since Lena Vasquez had taken his voice away, he felt something other than rage and despair. He felt a small, dangerous flicker of something that he did not have a Dravasi word for, but that humans called hope. He activated his personal terminal and composed a message. It was a written message, the first written message a Dravasi warlord had ever sent to an enemy. Because the Dravasi did not write to their enemies. They roared at them, they challenged them, they crushed them, but they did not write to them. He addressed it to Commander Lena Vasquez, Terran Cultural Liaison, Cradle of Tongues Station. The message was one line long. It said, "Teach me." He sent it, and then he sat back and stared at the trophy wall of his conquered systems, and waited in the silence that was no longer just emptiness, but was now the space between what he had been and what he might still become. Across the void on a spinning station between two dead stars, Lena Vasquez opened the message on her tablet and read it. Twice. P. And then she smiled, because she had been waiting for it. She had been waiting for it since the moment she chose to strike his laryngeal nerve instead of his carotid artery. Since the moment she decided to take his voice instead of his life. Since the moment she made a bet that the most feared warlord in Dravasi space was not just a monster, but a mind. The neutral moon of Thesara 4 was a barren place, a gray rock orbiting a gas giant that nobody had ever bothered to claim because there was nothing on it worth fighting over, which made it perfect for two people who belonged to species that had every reason to fight. Lena Vasquez arrived first, stepping off a Terran shuttle with a small security detail of 4 Marines who spread out around the meeting facility with the quiet efficiency of people who were very good at violence but preferred not to use it. She carried a single bag containing data tablets, reference materials, and a modified holographic projector she had spent the last 3 weeks building in her quarters on the cradle. Terran intelligence had advised her strongly against this meeting. The advisory had been polite but firm in the way that intelligence agencies were polite and firm when they thought you were making a terrible mistake. They pointed out that Krethvos was a warlord who had personally killed thousands, that his species resolved emotional conflict through physical dominance, and that a Terran woman alone with him on a dead moon was a scenario that appeared in threat assessment textbooks as an example of what not to do. Lena had read the advisory carefully, and then she had filed it in the folder she kept for things that were technically correct but practically useless. She knew Kreth Vaz better than any intelligence analyst because she had spent 4 years inside his language, inside the patterns of thought that language revealed, and she understood something that data profiles could never capture. The message he had sent her was not a trick, and it was not a trap. It was the single bravest thing a Dravasi warlord had ever done. Kreth Vaz arrived 30 minutes later in a Dravasi dropship that scorched the landing pad and shook the walls of the facility. He walked through the door alone. Without warriors meant one of two things. Either you considered yourself already defeated, or you trusted the person you were meeting with your life. The fact that every Dravosi intelligence officer who learned about this meeting assumed it was the first option told Lena everything she needed to know about why Kreth Vaz was different. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, this enormous scarred reptilian warrior with copper eyes and claws that could tear through hull plating. And she looked back at him, this small human woman who had taken his voice and was now offering to give him a new one. Neither of them spoke, which, given the circumstances, was both appropriate and slightly funny in a way that only Lena appreciated. She gestured for him to sit. They began. The first sessions were terrible. Lena had spent the 3 weeks since his message developing something entirely new, a gestural communication system she called Dravasign, built on the principles of Terran Sign Language, but adapted completely for Dravosi physiology. Human Sign Language used 5 fingers and relied on subtle wrist movements and facial expressions that Dravosi faces could not produce. Kreth Vaz had 4 claws per hand, different joint articulation in his wrists, and a facial structure that communicated through scale color shifts rather than muscle movements. So, Lena had rebuilt everything from the ground up, mapping Terran linguistic concepts onto Dravosi body mechanics, creating a system that felt natural to his species, while carrying the depth and nuance that Dravosi spoken language had never developed. Because that was the secret she had discovered during her years of study. Dravosi spoken language was powerful but limited. It was built for dominance and submission, for commands and challenges and declarations of conquest. And it had almost no vocabulary for subtlety, for doubt, for tenderness, for the quiet, complicated emotions that existed between certainty and surrender. The language had shaped the culture, and the culture had shaped the language, and the result was a species trapped inside a way of thinking that only allowed 2 modes, strong or weak. Drav's sign would change that. But first Kreth Vaz had to learn it, and learning it was the hardest thing he had ever done. He was a warrior who had conquered star systems, who had fought enemies 10 times his number, and won through sheer force of will. But sitting at a table across from a human woman, and trying to make his killing hands form shapes that meant words, required a kind of strength he had never been asked to use. Patience, vulnerability, the willingness to fail and try again. He failed constantly. His claws were too tense, his movements too sharp, his instinct always pulling him toward the aggressive gestures that felt natural, and away from the subtle ones that carried the meanings he actually needed. On the 3rd day, he lost his temper completely. He stood up so fast that his chair flew backward into the wall and shattered, and he slammed his fists on the table hard enough to crack the surface. And he stood there, breathing heavily, with his copper eyes blazing, and his scales flushed dark with fury and frustration and grief. Lena did not flinch. She did not call for security. She did not move at all. She sat in her chair, and she waited. And when the rage had burned through him and left him standing in the wreckage of the furniture with his massive chest heaving. She raised her hands and signed 3 words in the system she had built for him. "Are you finished?" It was not a question, not the way she signed it. It was a statement, delivered with the calm, absolute certainty of a person who had already measured every possible outcome of this moment, and was not worried about any of them. Krethvas stared at her. Then something broke inside him. Not the way things had broken before, not the sharp, destructive breaking of his voice in that bar, but a slower, deeper breaking. The kind that happens when a wall that has been holding back everything finally comes down. He sank back into what was left of his chair, and he put his head in his hands, and his shoulders shook. And Lena realized that she was watching a Dravazi warlord cry for what was almost certainly the first time in his entire life. She let him. She did not comfort him because comfort was not what he needed, and she knew that touching a Dravazi in a moment of vulnerability was considered the deepest possible insult. She simply waited, present and silent and steady, until he raised his head and looked at her with eyes that were red and raw and completely without armor. Then she signed slowly, again, and he signed back, clumsy and broken and imperfect, again. They worked for 4 more weeks. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, Krethvas learned to speak with his hands. He learned that a gentle curve of his primary claw could express uncertainty, that a rotation of his wrist could soften a statement into a question, that the speed and rhythm of his gestures could carry emotion the way volume and tone once had. He discovered that silence was not empty. It was full. It was rich. It was a space where meaning could exist without being forced into the narrow channels of sound. He began to say things in Drav sign that he had never been able to say in spoken Dravosi because the words had simply not existed. He signed things about fear, about regret, about the hollow feeling of standing over a conquered enemy and wondering if this was really all there was. One evening after a long session, as the gray light of the gas giant filtered through the facility windows, Krethvas signed to Lena, "I grabbed your throat because I feared your words." "More than any weapon," Lena signed back. "I know. That is why I took your voice instead of your life." He stared at her for a long time, processing this, understanding for the first time that the strike that had destroyed him had been a choice, a precise and deliberate choice made by someone who could have killed him just as easily, and had decided he was worth more alive. "You are the most dangerous creature I have ever encountered," he signed. "Thank you," she signed back, and there was the ghost of a smile on her face. Word of what was happening on Thessara 4 leaked out slowly, and then all at once, and across Dravasi space the reaction was divided between outrage and fascination. Younger warriors, the ones who had grown up in the shadow of endless conquest and were beginning to quietly question whether conquering was all there was, began studying the fragments of Dravsign that circulated on military communications networks. First, as a tactical tool, a way to communicate silently on the battlefield, but then they began using it for other things, private things, things they could not say out loud in a culture that only respected volume. And on the Dravosi throne world, in the war chambers of the Mauve Dominion, Thalriz watched these developments with growing alarm, and made his decision. He sent orders to the fleet. The target was Terran shipping in the Helios corridor. War was coming, and he intended to start it before the voiceless warlord and his human teacher could stop him. He lay on the arena floor, beaten and breathing hard, and Krethvas stood over him with one foot on his chest in the traditional pose of victory. The arena expected what always came next, the killing blow, the final roar of triumph, the ancient ending to the ancient ritual. Krethvas looked down at his defeated rival. Then he stepped back and signed to the conclave, and the screens translated his words for 50,000 witnesses. "He will live. Let him learn. That is the Terran way, and it is now mine." The arena was silent for 5 full heartbeats. And someone began to pound their fist against the stone seating, the Dravasi equivalent of applause, and then another joined, and another, until the entire grand arena shook with the sound of 50,000 fists hammering stone in a rhythm that had nothing to do with conquest, and everything to do with something new. The conclave ratified Krethvaz as supreme warlord before the dust had settled. His first order, issued in writing, in sign, translated by Terran technology for every world in the Dominion to see, was the immediate cancellation of all military operations against human space. His second order surprised everyone, including Lena. He declared Drob Sign an official language of the Dravasi Dominion, equal in status to the spoken tongue, and he ordered that it be taught in every military academy and every school on the throne world. The voiceless warlord had spoken, and 50,000 warriors had heard him. 6 months after a warlord grabbed a linguist by the throat in a bar between 2 dead stars, the galaxy looked different. Not in the dramatic way that galaxies change after wars, not with borders redrawn in blood and civilizations cracked open by fleet bombardments, but in the quieter way that matters more, the way that seeds change soil long before anyone notices the garden. It started with the Dravasi. Within weeks of Krethvas declaring Drav Sign an official language, something unexpected happened across Dravasi space that none of the political analysts or intelligence agencies or cultural historians had predicted. Young warriors embraced it, not just as a tactical battlefield tool, which was how the military academies initially framed it, but as something personal, something private, something that allowed them to express thoughts and feelings that the spoken Dravasi language had never given them words for. Dominance and submission, for orders and challenges and declarations of strength. And for 10,000 years, that had been enough, because the culture demanded nothing else. But Drav Singh was different. Drav Singh had been built by a human who understood that language shapes thought, and that a language without words for gentleness produces a people who do not know how to be gentle. And so she had woven into its structure the capacity for softness, for uncertainty, for the kind of honest vulnerability that Dravasi warriors had always felt, but had never been able to name. Warriors began signing to each other in the barracks, late at night, saying things they could never say out loud. They signed about fear, about the hollow feeling after a conquest, about the grief of losing comrades that Dravasi culture demanded they never acknowledge, about the quiet, persistent question that had haunted their species for millennia. Was this all there was? Their children, in the privacy of their homes, using gentle gestures to express affection that Dravasi spoken language literally did not have words for. And those children grew up knowing something that no generation before them had known, that strength and tenderness could live in the same hands. The change rippled outward, beyond the Dominion. Other species noticed what was happening, species that had their own voiceless, their own marginalized populations who could not hear or could not speak, individuals who had spent their lives trapped in cultures that measured worth by the ability to produce sound. A Thesserai delegate who had been deaf from birth watched the footage of Krethvaz signing his recitation of worth in the grand arena and wept because for the first time in her life she saw a powerful figure in the galaxy who communicated the way she did. A Kolhari elder who had lost his voice to a degenerative disease watched the same footage and felt something unlock inside his chest that he had kept sealed for 20 years. Drav Sign became a bridge. Linguists from a dozen species began adapting its principles to their own physiologies, creating signed languages that worked for 6-fingered hands and tentacles, and species that communicated partially through bioluminescence. And Lena Vasquez consulted on every single one of them, because she understood better than anyone that language was not just about communication. Language was about the right to exist fully in the world, and every being deserved a way to speak, regardless of whether sound was involved. The Thessera Accords were signed on the same dead moon where Krethvas had learned to speak with his hands. The ceremony was held in the same facility where he had smashed a chair in frustration, and where Lena had signed, "Are you finished?" with the calm patience of someone who had already decided to save him, whether he cooperated or not. Established the first formal alliance between the Dravasi Dominion and the Terran Union, a partnership that every political expert in the galaxy had considered impossible 6 months earlier, because the two species could not have been more different. And yet here they were, signing a treaty that would reshape the balance of power in 3 sectors, open trade routes that had been closed for decades, establish joint research programs in xenolinguistics and cultural studies, and create a framework for peaceful conflict resolution that other species could adopt. The treaty contained a clause that Krethvas had insisted on personally, one that surprised the Terran negotiators and moved Lena in a way she did not show on her face, but that her hands betrayed with a slight tremor when she read it. The clause required all Dravasi diplomatic envoys to learn at least one form of nonverbal communication before they could be certified for foreign service. Who represented the Dominion to the galaxy would carry with them a reminder that power was not only found in the voice, that understanding mattered more than volume, and that the greatest strength was the ability to listen in every possible way. The night after the signing ceremony, after the politicians and the journalists and the analysts had all left, Lena Vasquez and Krethvas sat together in the bar on the Cradle of Tongues. The same bar, the same alcove, the same table that still had a scratch on its surface from where his claws had dug in 6 months ago when he had leaned across it to grab her throat. Lena had a drink in front of her, something amber and Terran that the bartender had learned to stock specifically for her, because she was now the most famous human in 3 sectors, and the bartender was not stupid. Krethvas sat across from her, enormous and scarred and silent, his copper eyes reflecting the low light of the bar. Each other for a while, in a silence that was not empty, but full. The kind of silence that exists between 2 people who have been through something together that words, spoken or signed, can only partially describe. Then Krethvas raised his hands and signed, "I have thought about what you did to me in this place." Lena signed back, "And? You could have killed me. Your strike was precise enough. You chose not to. Why?" Lena paused. She looked at him, at this warlord who had conquered 12 systems and had been brought to his knees by a woman half his size, who had lost his voice and found a new one, who had changed his entire civilization because a human had believed he was capable of change. She signed slowly, carefully, choosing each gesture the way she chose every word in every language she spoke, with precision and intention and the deep understanding that language was the most powerful weapon and the most powerful gift that any species had ever known. "Because a dead enemy teaches no one anything," she signed. "A changed enemy changes the world." Krethvas considered this for a long time. His copper eyes were steady on hers, and in them she could see the warlord he had been, and the leader he had become, and the vast, difficult distance between those 2 things that he had crossed on bleeding feet, with her walking beside him. Then he did something she had never taught him. He pressed his 4 claws to his chest, held them there for a moment over the place where his heart beat, beneath his scales, and then extended them outward toward her, opening his hands slowly, his claws spreading apart, in a gesture that looked like a flower blooming, or a star being born. "I made this sign myself," he told her in Drav sign. "It means, you defeated me, and I am greater for it." Lena looked at the gesture, and she memorized it the way she memorized everything, completely and permanently, and she felt something, warm and fierce, rise in her chest that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the knowledge that she had been right about him from the beginning. She raised her glass to him. He raised his, a massive Dravasi drinking vessel that looked like it could double as a weapon. They drank together in the comfortable silence of two people who had moved beyond the need for words. At a table nearby, a young Dravasi warrior who had come to the cradle on a merchant escort leaned toward her companion, an older trader with faded scales and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much of the galaxy. "Who is that Terran?" the young warrior asked, nodding toward the small human woman sharing a drink with the Supreme Warlord, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. The old trader looked at Lena Vasquez, at her calm, steady hands, and her quiet eyes, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that radiated from her like heat from a star. And he remembered the night 6 months ago when he had watched her fall from a warlord's grip and land on her feet and sit back down and order a drink, as if nothing had happened. "That," he said, "is the woman who taught the Dravasi that the loudest voice in the room is not always the strongest, and that the strongest voice does not need sound at all." The young warrior watched Lena and Krethvas sign something to each other that made the warlord's scales shift to a color she had never seen on a Dravasi before. A soft, warm shade that she did not have a word for, and she thought about everything she had been taught, about strength and power, and what it meant to be a warrior. Then she looked down at her own four-clawed hands, and she began to practice the signs she had been learning in secret from the training videos that had spread through every barracks in the Dominion. Across the galaxy, in 100 bars and barracks and homes and ships and stations, moving to Dravosi hands and Thessary hands and Kolhari tendrils and human fingers, all of them shaping silence into meaning, all of them proving what one small Terran woman had known all along, that the most dangerous thing about humans was not their weapons or their ships or their soldiers, it was their stubborn, relentless, terrifying insistence on understanding you. They would learn your language and your history and your poetry and your anatomy and your deepest cultural secrets, and they would use all of it, every single piece of it, not to destroy you, but to find the one precise place where you could be reached and changed and saved. And by the time you realized how deeply they understood you, it was already too late. You were already better. The galaxy was still vast and dark, and full of species with claws and fangs and plasma cannons who measured humans and found them wanting. Too small, too soft, too fragile, too fond of talking. Should be fighting. And one by one, system by system, world by world, they all learned the same lesson.